The airport buzzed with the usual mix of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and distant announcements echoing over the intercom. Among the crowd, a poised black woman in a navy blue business suit maneuvered her way toward the baggage claim. Her suitcase wasn't flashy, just a simple black roller bag, but it held more than clothes and toiletries. It carried the essence of who she was, a meticulous professional who had spent years building a career defined by discipline, intelligence, and an unyielding sense of justice. As she reached the carousel and grabbed her suitcase, she felt the familiar weight of her belongings and thought about the long week ahead. She had a docket full of high-profile cases waiting for her in the federal courthouse. But before she could dwell on the responsibilities that lay ahead, a sharp voice broke through the hum of the terminal. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," said a uniformed police officer, his tone curt and commanding. She looked up, confused but calm. The officer, tall and broad-shouldered, gestured toward her suitcase. His badge caught the light as he repeated, louder this time, "Step over here, please. I need to inspect your bag." For a moment, she hesitated. She had nothing to hide. Her bag contained the usual essentials: a laptop, court files, a couple of books, and some neatly folded clothes. Still, the officer's tone carried an edge that made her stomach tighten. She nodded and wheeled her suitcase toward the inspection area. "I'll need to open this," the officer said, his voice gruff. He didn't wait for her response before snapping on a pair of gloves and unzipping the bag. She watched as he rummaged through her belongings, pulling out items one by one. Her silk blouses, her legal briefs, even her well-worn Bible were handled with an air of suspicion. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "Contraband," he replied without meeting her eyes. She raised an eyebrow. "Contraband? I'm not sure what gave you that impression." The officer didn't answer. Instead, he continued his search, his movements growing more aggressive. He pulled out a folder labeled "Confidential" and flipped it open carelessly, glancing at the legal documents inside before tossing it aside. Her patience began to wear thin, but she held her composure. She had faced tougher situations before and knew better than to escalate unnecessarily. But then, without warning, the officer grabbed the suitcase, flipped it over, and dumped its contents onto the cold, tiled floor of the terminal. Clothes scattered, papers fluttered. Her laptop clattered loudly, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The woman's heart sank as she stared at the mess. Her hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. The officer stood over the pile, his expression smug, as though he had uncovered some great crime. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice now tinged with frustration. "Necessary? I'm doing my job," he shot back. "People like you think you can waltz through security without consequences." Her eyebrows furrowed. "People like me." He didn't answer. Instead, he bent down, sifting through the pile as if searching for some incriminating evidence that wasn't there. The woman glanced around, noticing the growing crowd of onlookers. Some appeared sympathetic, while others merely watched with morbid curiosity. Her cheeks burned, not with embarrassment, but with a simmering anger she was trying desperately to contain. The officer finally straightened up, holding a small toiletry bag as if it were evidence of a crime. "What's in here?" he demanded. "Toothpaste and shampoo," she replied evenly. He unzipped it anyway, pulling out the contents and holding them up for everyone to see. The woman crossed her arms, her patience hanging by a thread. She wasn't just a traveler being harassed, she was a federal judge who had dedicated her life to upholding the law. And yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. The officer, still oblivious to who he was dealing with, smirked as he emptied the last of her belongings onto the floor. "Looks like nothing to me," he muttered, almost disappointed. The woman bent down, beginning to gather her scattered possessions. Her movements were deliberate, but her mind raced. She had spent years fighting for justice, ensuring that people were treated fairly regardless of their background. Now she found herself on the other side of the line, facing an unwarranted abuse of power. As she stood up and met the officer's gaze, her voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "You've made quite a scene. And now, You've got my full attention. Do you have any idea who I am? The officer scoffed. Should I? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a slim leather case. She opened it slowly, revealing her federal credentials for everyone to see. The officer's smirk faded as he leaned in for a closer look. His face paled. The crowd, still watching, began to whisper among themselves. For the first time, the officer seemed uncertain. He cleared his throat, his bravado faltering. I was just doing my job," he stammered. The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Oh, don't worry. I understand exactly what you were doing. And now, we're going to talk about it." The scene froze in tension as the officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his actions might have consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. The woman's calm exterior belied the storm brewing beneath, a storm that would soon turn this encounter into a lesson he would never forget. The officer's throat tightened as he stared at the badge in her hand. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, confident in his actions and the authority his uniform granted him. But now, the weight of his choices was settling in, and it was heavier than he ever imagined. He blinked, trying to process the words etched on the small, unassuming badge. United States Federal Judge. The woman, still calm and composed, slipped her credentials back into her blazer and began gathering the rest of her belongings from the floor. Her movements were deliberate, almost methodical, as if she was giving him time to reflect on his actions. The crowd that had gathered was still watching, their whispers growing louder. "She's a judge," someone murmured. "Man, he's in trouble now." But the officer wasn't paying attention to the onlookers anymore. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. He cleared his throat, stepping forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she carefully picked up her laptop, inspecting it for damage. The screen was cracked, and she let out a quiet sigh before placing it back into her bag. Finally, she straightened up, her gaze steady and unflinching. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone measured. "Is that what you called dumping someone's personal belongings in the middle of an airport?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again. What could he possibly say? He had no justification for his actions, no excuse that would make sense. He had acted on impulse, on an assumption he now deeply regretted. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, "I was just trying to do my job." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your job is to enforce the law, not to humiliate innocent people in public. Or am I mistaken?" He shifted uncomfortably, his confidence from earlier completely gone. The crowd around them was growing restless, some of them pulling out phones to record the scene. The officer noticed and felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. This was quickly spiraling out of control, and he knew it. The woman noticed the phones too, but didn't seem fazed. She wasn't here to make a spectacle of him. That wasn't her style. No, she was here to make a point she hoped he and everyone else watching would remember. "I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Maybe you were having a bad day. Maybe you let your biases cloud your judgment. Whatever your reasons were, the fact remains, you were wrong. And being wrong has consequences." The officer swallowed hard, his palms beginning to sweat. I'm sorry," he said finally, the words tumbling out awkwardly. "Sorry," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "You're sorry." "I am," he said quickly. "I didn't mean." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save your apologies. They're not for me. They're for every person who's ever been treated like this and didn't have the power to push back. Do you understand that?" He nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. All he knew was that he wanted this moment to end. The woman took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly. She didn't enjoy this, not the confrontation, not the public scrutiny. But she knew it was necessary. Too many people had been through similar experiences, and too many had walked away feeling powerless. She couldn't let that happen here. As she began to repack her suitcase, she felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her. Some looked at her with admiration, others with curiosity. She could sense their questions. Who is she? How does she stay so composed? But she didn't owe them answers. Not yet, Anyway, the officer, meanwhile, stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to help her pick up her belongings, to show that he was genuinely remorseful, but he was afraid she'd reject the gesture. Instead, he stood there awkwardly, his hands at his sides, feeling more powerless than he ever had in his career. A man in a suit stepped forward from the crowd, his voice cutting through the tension. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said respectfully. "I couldn't help but notice what just happened. If you need a witness, I saw everything." She looked up at him, studying his face. He seemed sincere, and she appreciated the offer. "Thank you," she said with a small nod. "I may take you up on that." The officer's heart sank further. A witness? This was worse than he thought. He could already picture the headlines. Police officer accused of racial profiling federal judge at airport. His career, his reputation, it was all hanging by a thread. The woman zipped up her suitcase and stood to her full height, her posture exuding quiet strength. "You're lucky," she said to the officer, her tone softer now but no less firm. "Lucky that I believe in second chances, but make no mistake, this isn't over." With that, she turned and began walking away, the crowd parting to let her pass. The officer watched her go, his stomach churning. He wanted to call after her, to plead his case, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, surrounded by the mess he created, and hope that somehow he could make things right. As she walked through the terminal, the woman felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anger, yes, but also sadness. Sadness that, even in her position of power, she wasn't immune to the kind of treatment so many others faced every day. She thought about her parents, who had marched for civil rights decades ago, and about the stories they told her of their struggles. She had always hoped that things would be different for her generation. But moments like this reminded her how far there was still to go. She reached a quiet corner of the airport and sat down on a bench, pulling out her phone. She didn't want to make this a public spectacle, but she also knew she couldn't let it slide. She needed to report the incident, not just for herself, but for everyone else who might face a similar situation in the future. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated her next move. Should she call her colleagues at the courthouse? Should she contact the airport authorities? Or should she handle this herself, quietly and efficiently, the way she always did? Before she could decide, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me," the man in the suit said again, approaching her cautiously. "I don't mean to bother you, but I just wanted to say I admire how you handled that back there." She looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said. "It wasn't easy." "I can imagine," he said, sitting down on the bench beside her. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. I've seen too many situations like that, and it's about time someone stood up to it." His words struck a chord with her. Maybe she didn't have to handle this alone. Maybe this was an opportunity to shine a light on a problem that too often went unnoticed. She nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "Actually," she said, "there is something you can do."